Hello, everyone. We hope your week's going well.
I did the like.
It's been a busy week regardless. Everybody's there's stuff going on. I guess that's kind of where we're at this semester, is that every single day is a busy day. Even the days that are relaxing are busy days. So what's I going to say? Something really important to say, and that's where I'm at. My mind is just gone. I was just going to say something really important. It's not gone. Oh yeah, I do have something important to say. So just a reminder, we are going to be starting on Ultrix 2 on Friday. That will be preceded by the first quiz we've had in 3 weeks. I know it's been a nice break, but need to get back at it. I do have to do some assessment in this course, so please make sure you know that. Just for context, it will be the same length quiz as before. It'll be 5 questions, 15 points. I'm going to do 2 questions about the previous Ultrix assignment and then 1 question each from each of the previous activities. So that should give you context for what you need to look at. I tried to make the questions from the activities themselves, the class discussions, not so specific because I know you have 3 of them to study, but we'll see what happens. All right, today we're going to be doing a topic that I don't love. I will say that this is not something that I'm enthusiastic about talking about. Part of it's interesting. The first question is kind of an interesting discussion. But this is very technical, and so this is kind of, as I've used the analogy before, this is kind of the vegetables of the course. This is the stuff that you have to put on the plate. And I don't know, if you like Brussels sprouts, kudos to you. Actually, I do kind of like Brussels sprouts if they're prepared correctly. Has anybody ever had like roasted Brussels sprouts? You know, put bacon on. Yeah, good stuff, good stuff. But yeah, when you're a kid, all you get is slimy microwave stuff. Nobody wants to eat that. This is slimy microwave Brussels sprouts right here. This is what we've got right here for us. Today we're going to talk about data management and data governance, and I do think that there's some interesting discussions with respect to this. We've already had the computer's freaking out on me. Okay, trying to make it a bit more. It's not doing that. It's instead to scrolling up and down. There we go. So we've already had the distinction discussion about the difference between information and data, and data is by far more prominent. Depending on who you talk to, data is going to be just basically gathered in every moment of every second of every single day. When I went to a conference a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Caden and Dr. Eisen, and there was an instructor from another university, and I think I told you this, but she was fully convinced that every single discussion, every single soundbite, every single piece of information and detail, I shouldn't say information, every single detail is being captured by people's phones all the time. Like your phones are constantly on. You know, you've got these devices and they are gathering information. And I thought about the logistics of that and how much power and how much storage space that would require. And it just kind of boggles the mind. I don't think that that's actually happening. But suffice to say, there is a lot of data out there. All right. I know that's the statement of the course. You're going to go back to your homes on holiday break and say, well, what are you learning? It's like, we learned there's a lot of data out there, and yeah, it's going to be one of those profound things that's just like, huh, okay, I guess your instructor's really earned that PhD of his. Yeah. Yeah, I try to make the really obvious statements sound profound, guys. That's how you earn a PhD. Okay, you make very, very obvious statements, and then you make them sound very, very intelligent. Okay, hopefully I sounded intelligent when I said that. That being said, a lot of data out there, which means that there's a lot of opportunity for data, a lot of opportunity for transition to valuable information. The way that we've traditionally thought about data up until the past few decades has been very, very linear. It's basically been printed or written text that can be easily transformed and analyzed within computerized tools. We're starting to move to the point now that we're going to see a lot of transformation of different data types. In my AIS class, we actually talked about the different forms of data, and there's basically unstructured data out there that has a lot of value that potentially is associated with it. We have just not found ways of analyzing it. And so the more time that we spend transitioning into being able to analyze information or transfer data into information and get some value out of it, I think the better off that we can see all of our lives operate, because we can make better decisions. I mean, depending on what your perspective is, there are definitely pros and cons. We've already talked about privacy, or talked about confidentiality information. We've talked about the loss of data, the data breaches that have occurred. So there's definitely some concerns in that regard, but there's also some high upsides we can have, as long as we know what the proper protocols for governing and managing data are. All right, so to make sure that we get off on the bang, I decided to start off with the most fun question first in this one. Okay, so I want you all to defend the following statements, and my fondness for soy logo, I'm going to make you defend both sides of the point. I want you to make sure that you argue it. That's just a good policy to get into, by the way. I don't want to govern anybody's ideology in this course, but be sure that you can understand all perspectives of an argument when you go into it, because that gives you much more insight, and it will make you a happier, healthier person. At least happier, happier. Let's go ahead and talk really quickly about these statements. All right. So I want you to defend the statement: data is an asset, data is not an asset. Now, the perspective of the CPA Journal article was definitely that data is an asset. That was kind of the argument, or the title of the paper. I think the title of the paper is "Managing Data as an Asset." Let's see, how does that go? Yeah, managing data as an asset. That's actually the title of the paper. So there's going to be a very, very easy association, a very, very easy inclination to that. But I wanted to see what your perspective was, see what kind of arguments you took and what perspectives you took on this particular position. All right, so let's start in the middle. John, why don't you start us off here? So what's your argument for your group's argument for data being an asset?
So I personally thought that it is an asset that could be used for direct revenue. I said that we sold, it could also be used to improve decision making. I said there's like times when it wouldn't be an asset. No one used in my group, and he basically it was an asset at all. He said like 99% of the time it's not an asset.
Okay, did you have a rumble to figure out who was right in this one?
No, he's not.
That would have been an interesting side bet to see who would actually win that. I'm not sure what the bet would be. Like, whoever scores the first goal, I'm going to put my money on you that one. But yeah, what's that?
Of course.
Of course. Okay. Yeah. That would be a possibility as well. So maybe we'll remember that for the Masters. We'll say, okay, there was a grudge match that needed to be settled here between Dylan and John. Okay. I have to remember that. You guys will have to remember it. I won't remember this, but unless I document it, I forget it. Okay, so I think that there's a valid argument to both, but I want to kind of focus on the first part, data being an asset. All right. So what is kind of the ultimate objective of most organizations? And I'm going to clarify that when I say for-profit organizations. They're trying to generate what? They're trying to generate revenue, or ultimately profit, but they want to generate revenue as a means to generate profit. How do most organizations generate revenues? Some organizations provide services, some organizations provide goods, but regardless of what you classify them, we're going to say they provide resources that people want to obtain. All right. Can we classify data as a resource? What do you guys think? Just in a very general term, is data a resource? Yeah, and I think it's very easy to make that argument that data is a resource. Therefore, if it's a resource and it can be used to generate revenues to improve position of organization, then it kind of meets the traditional definition of an asset. Because if we make the argument that assets are what we use to generate revenues, those items we use to generate revenues, then the data kind of falls in that same category. Now, there's some interesting distinctions to make. Is that a lot of organizations have traditionally only kind of viewed the tangible items. And I'm separating from intangible assets. Data is not an intangible asset as defined by intangible asset in accounting purpose. But I'm not trying to categorize it as an intangible asset category. I'm trying to make a distinction that's actually legitimately intangible. You can't put your hand on data. So these tangible items that we would use to generate revenues, like in a manufacturing environment, we use metal to make a vehicle, which we'd sell to a customer. And so that would be an example of a tangible item. And that's kind of been the traditional view. It's only been fairly recently, and I say fairly recently, we probably could talk within the past half century, which is fairly recently in all of human history, that we've recognized that data also has its own value. And the question is that does that value equate to what we think of as with an asset? And that's I think there's a strong argument to say yes, it is. It is not tangible in the way most assets are, but it definitely has characteristics of a lot of assets. The other side, Dylan's perspective, okay, Dylan's perspective is that data is not an asset. So I had you argue that point as well. So let's go ahead and see if what you come up with on that one. So Sydney, you're up on this one. What's your group say on this one?
So I mentioned that it has to be processable. Value. Colin said that it is either low to accountants, that it may create value of it, and then maybe not considered an asset, or it would not be considered an asset. It is owned by.
Okay. So there's some interesting perspectives there. I do like Maddie's perspective. I think there's an argument that data assets have to be owned by somebody or can't be owned by somebody else. There is a bit of distinction there because there are certain organizations that actually manage others' assets and treat them as their own. But I do think, arguably speaking, when we talk about assets, we talk about ownership by the organization, whereas most data is not owned by the organization. I do want to put a perspective on this and something that you may not have thought of. So how do we think of assets traditionally? What would be the accounting definition of an asset? Now, this is something that this is going to be Dunning-Kruger effect again. This is probably one of those things that you say, well, I know what the definition of an asset is, Dr. Barnes. I said, okay, give me the accounting definition of an asset. And you probably think about that and said, oh, I haven't really thought about that in some period of time. Probably not like 3 or 4 years since the last time since you took 220. But technical definition of an asset, okay, is called an unexpired cost. Technical definition of an asset is an unexpired cost. What are expired costs, by the way? There's another category that's also called expired costs. What are those? Give you a hint. Starts with letter E. The expenses, okay? Expenses are expired costs. Now, does that make sense that assets are unexpired costs and expenses are expired costs? We know expenses are costs because we categorize a lot of expenses as costs on the income statement. Cost of goods sold is an example of an expense. We have the cost. But where does cost of goods sold come from? Where does cost of goods sold come from? What is the transition that occurs when you create a cost of goods sold? Well, in most of our situations, we say, well, cost of goods sold happens when we sell inventory to a customer, and then we have to recognize the expense of selling that inventory. That expense is the cost of the inventory. In essence, we're transitioning or transforming an asset, an unexpired cost, into an expense, an expired cost. Now, by that definition, that means that assets in our traditional view are items that get consumed over time. Okay. Now, there are some caveats to that. There's some of them get consumed more readily than others, and not all of them are consumed solely for purposes of revenue generation. We talk about land. Land is viewed as not being consumed, although there's an argument for that. By the way, can't depreciate land. Just don't want to repeat that. We can't depreciate land. There can be depletion associated with land if there's resources associated with it, and there can be impairment if the value of it goes down. So it can be utilized to some degree, but for the most part, we don't view land as being consumed. But is that true is consumption of an asset true for every other type of asset that we view? I should say most. So we're going to start getting into intangibles now. Somebody's going to raise their hand and say, what about intangible assets, Dr. Barnes? I said, we're not in Dr. Ison's class. Intangible assets don't exist. Okay, that's my point. I'm sticking to it. There's no such thing as intangible assets. All right, but do we consume most assets other than land and intangible assets? Somebody's going to come up with one other one and I've forgotten. I'm just going to be really embarrassed. Okay, I'm going to say it one time. Land and intangible assets. Ignoring those two, most other categories of assets, we say that those get consumed with use. Yeah, and we do have allocation systems associated with that. If we're talking about the direct selling or the direct generation of revenues, that's going to be a transition from an asset to an expense, direct transition. We're talking about consistent use where we recognize the loss in value. We can say, what's an example? A machine. What happens when a machine loses value? What's that called? Depreciation, okay? How does depreciation recognized? Well, it's a contra asset and then also an expense, okay? So it's a recognition of the loss in value of the asset and the recognition of expense. Reducing the asset value, increasing the expense value. Transforming something from an unexpired cost to an expired cost, okay? So that is a characteristic that we've viewed from an accounting perspective of assets. We've said this is something that we take for granted assets do. They transition into expenses over their life. Does that occur with data? Do we consume data in that same vein? Like if you use a piece of data, does that mean that piece of data is no longer useful in the future? can you use a piece of data for multiple purposes? The same piece of data. So presumption is that it doesn't get consumed. Now, that does not mean that it does not lose value, okay? We could make an argument that it does lose value, but the loss of the value has more to do with the relevance and reliability of the data rather than the actual usage of the data. So what I mean by that is, if I want to know what business cycle looks like in a particular period of time, looking at 2024 data is going to be highly more relevant than looking at 2015 data, okay? So the data for 2015 still exists. It has not been consumed. It just does not have the same value anymore because it's not as relevant as the current period data. So that's something to think about. When we talk about how we look at data is whether or not it's an asset. In some regards, yes, very strong argument for saying that it should be managed as an asset. In some regards, it does not meet our traditional accounting definition. But I asked you to come to a consensus, and everybody had to make a perspective or put their perspective on this. Okay, had to say which of these arguments is more suitable. And let's see. Who's gonna be the ultimate defender of this? Tyler, you are the ultimate defender of the class. You are the voice of the class, okay? What did you and your group say as far as whether data is an asset or not ultimately?
As a group, we didn't come to a consensus, but as an individual, I said as an optimist, data, I think it's like a raw material and you can turn it into materials. And then it helps companies for information and decision making as an asset.
Okay. And you made an interesting point, okay, because you talked about material, and I actually have in my definition. So I agree with you, and I think most of the class probably agree, okay? Dylan's maybe our lone holdout saying that it's not an asset, okay? Yeah, but and I'm not going to say there's a wrong or right answer on this one. If you have an argument for one perspective or another, I think they're both valid arguments, all right? The problem is if we don't categorize it an asset, I'm not sure what we categorize it as. But my argument is that they are resources and they can be transformed into something of value. Is that something that we've seen in accounting before of transforming a particular item into value? Well, yes. Tyler actually made the analogy. This is like taking materials and labor and transforming it to a finished good. Okay. I actually have it in my notes. It said much the same way the material and labor are viewed by those crazy cost accountants. Okay. All right. So ultimately speaking, there's not going to be a full unanimous distinction on this one because I think there's arguments in both directions, but I think we can make a fair argument that even if data is not an asset, we can treat it like an asset. We can actually evaluate it in that same context. All right. Next is a little bit easier definition, something that we've talked about already. So what is the difference between data and information, and provide an accounting analogy to illustrate the difference? Holden, you're up. What does your group say on this one?
You said that data is raw numbers, commas, and decimals, but information is like financial statements. So the analogy we use, data would be just lists of transactions.
Okay, good. So basically we're taking raw detail and we're transforming it into something of value. And there's some very, very straightforward ways of thinking about it. Looking at transactional information just in context, like if we put an entire series of transactions on a sheet of paper, didn't provide any context to it, so showed the debits and the credits without the name of the accounts, just showed the amounts, handed to somebody, they'd say, this is useless to me. This has no value to me whatsoever. But then Holden and his group, in their infinite wisdom, they basically kept this detail. They said, we know what the accounts are. We've actually set up the T accounts. We're going to set up the balance sheet. We can hand that same detail, just organized slightly differently to that individual, and they'll say, wow, this is great. My organization is doing so well. So there's a transformation process that occurs with data. And the idea being is that information is the value center of data. Information is the value transformation of data. Now, it's not to say that all data transformation into information is going to be valuable, okay? We could actually say there's negative value, particularly if there's unfortunate information that comes up from the data. Like if you look at data and you say, oh my gosh, there's a massive fraud going on in my organization. That might be negative detail, negative value. But generally speaking, we're assuming that transforming data into information provides more value than just the data by itself. I think that's an easy argument. It's a little bit like saying if you had a big stack of lumber in a corner, okay, and you put that lumber there, the lumber has value, okay. You can basically say it has a big stack of lumber that I can sell that to an external market, or if I'm really tired, I could go take a nap on that pile of lumber. But it has limited utility. It's only through that transformation process where we turn into a table or turn into a chair that we actually realize its ultimate or its full potential, its full value. So understanding the difference between data information really important. Again, I'm really bad about utilizing these terms anonymously. I think probably everybody does that on occasion. But having at least an understanding and distinction makes it a little bit clearer. All right, moving on to the group questions. So in the CPA Journal article, the authors state the organization should manage data in the same way they would manage an asset. Do you feel the statement implies that organizational mismanagement of data should be viewed as negligent or fraudulent in the same way organizational management of assets, mismanagement of assets would be? Olivia, what's your group say on this one?
I said that we think that definitely could imply that data could be negligently mismanaged. But that like maybe fraudulently would be like kind of different than like other like assets. And that like mismanagement could be considered negligent by having poor data security or protection.
Good. Yeah, so there's definitely some concerns with respect to how the asset's going to be managed because it's going to be different from traditional asset management. That being said, could we still have kind of a similar segregation of duties philosophy over data as we do over traditional assets or traditional resources? Probably. Here's another perspective as well. I shouldn't say another, it's not separate, but it's an additional perspective on this. When you are a stakeholder in an organization and you invest in an organization, I shouldn't say stakeholder, let's say stockholder specifically, a stockholder in an organization, and you're investing in that organization and you basically say, here are my resources that I'm investing in the organization. I know what the risks are associated with this. That's actually why I'm investing, because there's going to be a commensurate return. If that company loses all its assets, like it mismanages the assets, were you aware of that risk in that situation? Presumably, yes, because you knowingly made the investment. Now, you could make an argument, well, what if they were committing a fraud, Dr. Barnes, and I didn't know about that, and I was assuming that this mismanagement. There's arguments to say that, yeah, you were misled about the nature of the organization. But for the most part, if you invest in an organization, you lose all your money, that's a risk that you have willingly accepted as part of being a shareholder in the organization. Okay, so organizational mismanagement of assets, with respect to the shareholder perspective, who are the owners of those assets, they are knowingly taking on a risk that they may lose their resources because people may mismanage the assets of the organization. Now, are the owners of data the same people who own the assets in an organization? I think we argued about this just a second ago. We said that in a lot of situations, the owners of data are not the organization. I think this is Sydney's point just a little while ago, that the people who own the data are not necessarily the same people who own that. So if if organizations have custody of data, they are taking custody of a quote unquote asset that does not belong to them. And if they mismanage that, the people who could be harmed are people who did not actually knowingly accept the risk in putting that data out there. So my argument is that in this situation where there's fraudulent mismanagement of data, that may be something that we need to consider more severely than fraudulent mismanagement of assets. Because again, if you're a shareholder in a company, you know that there's some risk. If you're an owner of a data source that gets shared with another party, like a good example is the Cambridge Analytica breach. I think we talked about that in AIS, at least some of you. Does anybody remember Cambridge Analytica? So they were a big research group, quote unquote research group, that was doing research over Facebook, and they actually sent out a quiz. And their policy was on the quiz is that you had to provide assent to access data. Now, what they didn't say they said it in the fine print, but it was very hard to find that, is that you did not only provide assent to your data, but to all of the data on your friends list as well. Okay. So if Jenna agreed to do this quiz, then Kirsten's data was going to be, well, I'm assuming you guys are friends. Yeah, okay. All right. So yeah, that's kind of what ended up happening. So it was something like 270,000 people did the quiz, and it was like 87 million accounts were compromised. Now, the argument about that is that not only was that a problem, but the data was not used for the purposes that Cambridge Analytica said they were going to use it for. They used it actually for data mining with respects to the 2016 presidential election, which a lot of people were very unhappy about. Again, try not to get too much in depth on that because I'm not trying to get to ideological arguments, but I do think it's important to note that management of data is something that's not everybody has subject to or has a voice about. usually in this day and age, when you share data with an external resource, they do say, look, we gather data. You do need to be aware of that. Are you okay with that? Click yes or no. If he's like, no, I'm getting away from this website. I don't want my data gathered. Or you can opt out of certain information being, certain details being gathered. But for the most part, I think that there's a bigger responsibility with data because we don't have necessary connections to the people who have the ownership of that data. Now, the CBA article, or CBA Journal article mentions that organizational responsibilities for data are differing depending on the size of the organization. The implication that data management is easier for small organizations or harder for large organizations. And I think that's probably probably a very sensical statement. That makes it. It's an intuitive statement to say that. Okay, we're talking about smaller organizations. They probably have a lot fewer data risks or data concerns in that case. And large organizations are going to have a lot more exposure. They're going to have a lot more data, so they're just going to have a lot more risk associated with that. But I wanted to kind of take an opposite perspective on this to kind of see the entire scope of this issue. So in contrast, what might be some advantages that large organizations have over smaller organizations with respect to data management? Okay, and Jenna, I just picked on you, but I'm gonna have to do it again now. So what's your group say?
Said that large organizations have access to more resources to assist them with their data management.
Yes, so large organizations definitely have more access to resources. So it has to do with the same idea we talk about with respect to controls. Large organizations are definitely going to be subject to a lot more risks, but they're going to have a much more infrastructure to able to respond to those risks necessarily. Okay, so if you talk about the resources that are important for being able to address those problems, large organizations probably have a stronger infrastructure and probably better intellectual capital. I kind of think about my small organization example, Greek Corner Heroes. That's the one I went to. I actually ate there last night, which is probably fitting. I was really in the mood for a year. I don't know what the mood struck me. I said, yeah. How much data governance do you think they probably have in place there? Probably not very much. So even though there's a low risk of data exposure, if there was data exposure, there's probably no protections over it whatsoever. Okay, they don't even really consider that. Again, they're operating on a cash register that was probably created in the early 1990s, maybe late 1980s. So they probably do not have a lot of security and protocol in place. That is not to say it's not worthwhile eating there. Their food is delicious, okay, but it's probably not a place that you want to start posting a whole lot of detail about your life and sharing a lot of it's just not a good idea to you purchase using credit cards there, by the way, anyway, because they charge you if you use your credit card, okay, which is actually brilliant if you think about it. I'm getting way off track. Sorry, guys. All right. So yeah, that's kind of the argument we make is that we're talking about large organizations. Large organizations are definitely going to have a stronger infrastructure to be able to address these problems. So even though the job is harder for large organizations, they have more invested to be able to address these issues. All right. Part 5. I would not have even asked this question if agile methodology was not something that was talked about on the CPA exam. So I did want to take a little quick look at this. So agile methodology principles, they're in a CPA journal article. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at those. And there's a lot of them, okay? So as you want to look at these, and for the most part, I think most of these are fairly intuitive, okay? These are the approaches that you would take when you talk about data management or how to utilize data. So the agile methodology is one of those approaches. And they say, here's the agile methodology principles and how you can actually create a data-driven organization. So I wanted to kind of look through these and see what you all thought about this, and does this meet kind of what you believe would be a legitimate approach here? So looking at the agile methodology principles, I asked, which of these are the most intuitive and which principles are the least intuitive? So AJ, your group is up. What did you guys identify with respect to what you felt were the most intuitive principles?
Is that the second principle? So the one that talks about each iteration should increase values learning curves. And then as well as the second to last one, which is that the initiative should align with overall goals of the business are the most intuitive. That just seems to make sense. Like the work should align with the overall goals of the business. That's just what companies should do.
Yeah, and I think that I actually identified the second one, the one you identified. That was one of the ones I identified, and I also agree that initiatives should align with the goals of the business. That actually goes back to our discussion of governance from earlier in the semester. Remember, governance, IT governance, the focus is on value to the organization, not security, but on value. And so everything that we actually generate with respect to the organization should be actually tending that goal, should be contributing to that goal. So the alignment with the overall goals in the business, if we assume the overall goal of the business is to provide some sort of value, whatever form that may be, then that's what we need our initiatives, our steps to actually take. I did think there was another one that was kind of interesting. So they had freedom to fail is considered learning to do what to do or what not to do. Now, is that necessarily a pleasant thought to think about? The freedom to fail. None of us like the idea of failure. I tend to get catatonic when I make mistakes. Okay, it's just the way that I grew up. I don't like making mistakes. But how do we learn? We make mistakes. Okay, we learn. Okay, you put your finger on a hot stove and you're just kind of like, ow, that hurt, and it hurts for a long time. So like, I don't want to do that again. And hopefully you don't do that again. Most of us have done it multiple times. At least I've done it multiple times. So I'm admitting something to you all out there. But yeah, the idea being that we have an unpleasant externality, and with that externality comes knowledge, comes wisdom. And within an organization, the organization operates in the same way, especially if we're talking about things that we're not certain of what the outcome may be. We do not have a good definition for how we should manage data. Therefore, there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all distinction of how we actually should approach every single issue. It's like, okay, what should our data policy be with respect to gathering external details from people who visit our website? Should we gather all information, or I shouldn't say information, should we gather all data and inform them that we're doing so? Should we give them the option to opt out of gathering information? Should we just gather data and not expose that we're doing that? There are a lot of different policies and protocols that could be in place there. And until we actually experience those, we may not know what the best policy is going to be. Now, this kind of contradicts what we're talking about the next one. I said, which is the least intuitive? And this one was a little bit more challenging. John, I'm coming back to you. What's your group identify as the least intuitive?
You said the principle of feedback loop from customers increases the opportunity to succeed next to their expectations. You said companies usually want to focus on the internal.
Okay, that's a good argument. That's a good argument. So yeah, we tend to look inwardly and be able to address problems, issues. This is actually taking us into a realm that is external. So the feedback loop from the customers is basically saying this is how we address the issues, not necessarily what our own internal mechanism might take. So that is definitely something that might not be comfortable for a lot of organizations. So good observation there. Any other ones that any groups identified? I personally struggled with this one because I could not find one that I thought was just completely non-intuitive. I do think that there's a strong argument for that, but I do think there's also precedent for getting feedback from customers to improve protocols and operations. So that may be the least intuitive, but even then, if you try to make the argument, you say, Dr. Barnes, we had to select one because you told us to select one, but somebody may have stood out and said, you know what, I refuse. Okay, I'm not going to bow down to the machine here. I say that all of these are intuitive and these all make sense. And I think that was the goal here. That even though they're worded weirdly and it doesn't seem like something that we've seen before, and it isn't, not in this context, they all make sense. All right. I do think that the wording is really, really weird. It's works performed in iterations. That's not something that an average person will say. It's like, walk up to you and say, how are you doing today? I says, well, I'm performing my work in iterations. Okay. If you've ever had that conversation, I'm just going to tell you that's weird. Okay. That's just strange. But what are they saying there? It says that you actually stop at one point and you evaluate your work and what completion is, and then you go on to the next step. And the idea being is that you're self-governing every single phase, every single step in the work. And that makes perfect sense if you get past the language that's being used there. So that's kind of what my perspective is that I think that these are all fairly intuitive, but they're not necessarily worded in a way that's intuitive. All right, moving on to the CIO article. How is data governance defined? Okay, how is data governance defined? So, Sydney, we're back to your group. How did your group identify or define data governance?
Said some for defining organization or who within the organization authority all of assets and how those data assets.
Okay, good. So basically system for decision making relating to data and who's actually can utilize the data and who has responsibilities with respect to that area. So just that was a paraphrasing of what Sydney says and basically what my definition is on here. More interesting is that we have these terms of data governance and data management. Okay, now are these the same thing? First of all, probably not, because I wouldn't have asked you to make the distinction if they're not the same thing. So Sydney, sticking with you, what is the difference between data governance and data management?
Data governance, is just kind of like one part of the overall data management.
Right, so data management is using, the overall process is used to plan, specify, enable, create, acquire, maintain, use, archive, retrieve, and control and purge data. Whereas data governance is more about the responsibilities for those different areas. So as Sydney mentioned, it's a subset of data management. Data governance is a subset of data management. All right. Now, what is the single overarching goal of data governance? And this is something that was identified within the article. Tyler, again, you're the big picture guy of this particular discussion. Okay, I had you actually answer a big picture issue earlier. I mean, another big picture. Okay, because when I think Tyler Jones, I think big picture. Okay, so what is the overarching goal of data governance?
So to support an organization's overall data management strategy.
Good. Okay. Support organization's overall data management strategy. Basically, to determine what the responsibilities are, who's responsible for that, and making sure that they follow properly. Okay. Now, I had you refer to the BARC list of key organization goals, and I want you to compare them to the aspects of information from the ISMS. So let's go ahead and look at the BARC goals real quick. Okay. I looked at this earlier, so I would not be scrolling like this because I didn't want to do this again. I do this every single time. Okay, key organizational goals. Okay, minimize risk, establish internal roles for data use, implement compliance requirements, improve internal communication, increase value of data, facilitate administration of the above, reduce costs, help to ensure the continued existence of the company through risk management optimization, which I think are all reasonably sensible goals and goals that we should probably have with respect to data governance. Now, that being said, let's compare this to ISMS. What is ISMS again? What does that stand for? I think maybe I said it in the, did I say it actually? Yeah, I didn't actually tell you that. I'm brilliant, okay? I wanted you to figure out what the ISMS is. So that was actually back in week 2. We talked about this implementation of ISMS, information something. Yeah, information security management system, okay? And that was actually a set of standards that we talked about back then. Does anybody remember which set of standards? ISO 27000 series, ISO 27000 series we talked about. Now, what was the overarching background? We talked about this multiple times throughout this course. It's 3 letters, okay? The Central Intelligence Agency, okay? But CIA, what does CIA stand for?
Confidentiality, integrity, availability.
Confidentiality, integrity, and availability, okay? So interesting analysis to compare. So how do we actually compare these two here? So when we talk about an information security management system, what is the focus of an ISMS? What is probably the most important word in that in the name of that particular system? Security. Okay. So can we say confidentiality, integrity, and availability are all concepts that are related to the security of information? Yeah. And why is that the case? Why is that so important? Because remember, data itself can't have value, but it has to be transformed. Information inherently has value. So once it's transformed, it's a little bit like taking an asset and putting it into exposing that, okay? Having a stack of wood, somebody could steal that and they could make something of value out of it. But if we just say, okay, we're going to leave this chair out here just lying around, anybody can take it, that chair has inherent value, it has inherent worth, it's been transformed. So that's the distinction between data and information. So there's a necessary emphasis on security with respect to information. That's not to say that data does not have a focus on security, but overall, do the BARC goals focus specifically on just security? No, the BARC goals tend to focus more on the overall organizational objectives related to data, which includes overall maintenance of data and availability and value. There is security elements in there, but it's part of an overall span. Is that kind of consistent with the idea of IT governance that we talked about earlier in the semester? Yeah, IT governance, we talked about information technology should provide value to the organization. Part of that is definitely going to be security, but it's not the entire big picture. Now, you may argue that's not really fair, Dr. Barnes. You cherry picked. You actually picked information security management system. What if we talked about ITIL or what if we talked about COVID? And I say, you're right, there's different aspects to information, but that also illustrates the importance. We can't just have one overall arching objective that meets all of our criteria and all our standards. I think security is going to be far more paramount for information than for data. That being said, it's going to be important for both. Question number 8. It's our last question, isn't it? All right. 3 common roles within data governance. So what are these 3 common roles within data governance? And I forgot who's up next. Holden, you're up.
You said steering committee, data owner.
All right, so let's take a look. Steering committee, data owner, and data steward. So steering committee, data owner, and data steward. All right. So basically, without going into detail, steering committee is kind of oversight, kind of talks about what are going to be the objectives and the goals of data governance, and kind of sets the tone for that. Now, the data owner, that's the person responsible for ensuring the information, the specific data domain is governed across specific lines in businesses. Okay, so one who's kind of got responsibility for the day-to-day management of that data, or day-to-day governance of the data. I shouldn't say management. Data stewards are accountable for. Oh, sorry, I meant data stewards. I said data owner, and that was completely wrong. Those are the people who are ensuring that oversight is kind of at a organizational level, and these are the people who are responsible for day-to-day management. Okay, you caught me in a trap, and I apologize. But yeah, with respect to that, these concepts kind of follow a template, a pattern that we've talked about. Now, what's one of my favorite things to talk about in all of my courses? Okay, 3 concepts that seem to be very closely aligned with these concepts as well. Anybody can't figure that one out? So COSO framework, it definitely has related to internal controls, but I was thinking something more specifically. So the COSO framework, it does relate to the COSO framework, but it's actually specifically a type of controls within the COSO framework that's specified as COSO framework. Give you a hint, 3 letters, CAR. Yeah, custody authorization and record keeping, which we call segregation of duties. Okay, so if we think about it, we could actually make the argument that steering committee is kind of the authorization function. The data owner is going to be the custody function, and data steward is going to be the reporting function. Now, that's an argument. Is it a good argument? Probably not. I'm trying to simplify something where we're trying to make something very, very easy when it's not easy. There's a few issues with that. Okay. First of all, if you read through the data owner and data steward responsibilities, there's definitely some overlap in those responsibilities. Can there be overlap in segregation of duties? Not really. Okay. Overlap in segregation of duties means segregation of duties does not exist. Okay. Secondly, who are some of the primary members on the steering committee? The data steward and the data owner. Okay. They're actually specified that data steward and data owner are usually part of the steering committee. So the people who are authorizing transactions also have responsibility for recording and custody of those transactions. That's how we would view it from a segregation of duties perspective. Now, if you talk about that in an organization, say, okay, this person authorizes, but they also record transactions. What should your response be as a good Truman State accounting student? Dr. Barnes told me that's not correct. Okay, that was what you would say. Okay, me, I'd be cringing and just kind of shaking and shuddering a little bit. I'm trying to get you all to that point, but yeah. So we'd be a little bit concerned about that. So this doesn't nearly fit the architecture, but it's an interesting philosophy to take because we need to actually be able to understand what are the roles and responsibilities of these particular areas and having these assignments. Now, is there an argument for saying that it's okay that this doesn't necessarily meet the framework for segregation of duties? Answer is yes. If we're talking about the overall structure of data and custody and authorization of recording don't necessarily fit the same pattern because we're not necessarily going to have somebody with full custody of data because it's not somebody that's owned by the organization. We're not going to have somebody who's going to have full recording privileges because it's going to be captured in multiple different ways. So could be an argument saying that that's not a good analogy, and I would be willing to accept that. But again, trying to simplify this and make this a little bit easier to conceptualize, I do think that there's some discussion there. The distinction comes when we identify what are the problems with using this as the framework. All right, well, I guess that does it for data management and data governance. Again, got a quiz on Friday, so I'll see you all then.